Hello. I know I'm in bits. I was working all day. But listen, while I was coming home from work, I had an interesting thought that came into my head. Those of us who are old enough to remember the BBC back in the day, they used to have a TV show called Play for Today. And these were called kitchen sink dramas. They were essentially, they were always the same format. They were TV shows, plays, usually an hour long, that nearly always, in every case, took part in working class, ghettos, neighbourhoods in the north of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, and they always portrayed working class people as drug addicts, incestuous, uh, pathetic, disgusting, hopeless, and useless human beings. And it was done at the height of the Savile and the other, sex debt predators were in the BBC. All these public school boys, Stephen Frears and what's his name, Ken Loach and the rest of them, all these cultural Marxists would write TV shows that were always about how poor people were pathetic, worthless. Anyone who was in a council estate or grew up in a high-rise flat like I did was a junkie, was a wife beater, was fucking his sister, and all these kinds of things. And that life was hopeless. And yet these people were not from these backgrounds. And at the same time that was going on, they were oblivious deliberately and impervious deliberately to the likes of Jimmy Savile and the rest of them in the BBC. You had all these wealthy socialist, cultural Marxist types at the BBC writing all these these like poignant oh, this is how life is on the council estate. This is how the poor people live, and we public school boys who went to Eton and Harrow and Blockrock College in Ireland, we have to write these stories about these poor people and portray them as they really are. And yet none of these fuckers who wrote these films and these plays knew what working class people were like. The junkies, the dysfunctional stuff was the minority, but yet they would elevate it to the majority. And at the same time, while they were making their cultural Marxist social statement about what was going on for poor people who had no fucking control of their lives in this system, they were completely ignoring the Jimmy Saviles and the rest of these motherfuckers in the BBC because, well, it's easy to pick on poor people, isn't it? Isn't that the fucking cultural Marxist way? Another thing too is that at the last great one, the last big one was the woman who walked in the doors by Roddy Doyle, who wrote The Commitments, a very very funny book and film. But the last he played into that whole BBC cultural Marxist thing of like everything is desperate. That book was set in my hometown Ballymun, on the north side of Dublin, and yeah, there it was a very poor area. It was in bits actually, and yet there was a lot of like hopelessness and degradation and everything. But that was a small number of people bashed their wives around. A tiny number of people became junkies. And yet, Roddy Doyle, who's from like a nice middle class rural background, wrote this book about and TV show about how desperate it was in the ghetto. At the same time, too, an interesting dynamic exists. Not only were these poor people portrayed as desperate and pathetic, but there was always an under, a tinge of racism. Like if you were poor and you lived in the ghetto, if you lived in the slums, you were automatically hate blacks, Pakistanis, and so on. This was always portrayed within these kitchen sink dramas. Yet the reality was that these cultural Marxists, these public school boys, these wealthy white boys, upper middle class, and beyond that, like very wealthy white boys, socialists, and SWP types, would never see themselves as being bigoted towards the poor white working class. Interesting, isn't it? Another one too is just the like I said, the inability to you know see what was going on with the rich and the famous and the BBC around them, while at the same time having a go at the poor working class. And at the height of these kitchen sink dramas, at the height of these things like Boys from the Black Stuff on the BBC. Hello, Benny. Say hello to Benny. Benny's had an eye operation recently. Look at him. He looks great. He's all back to normal. But at the same time too, the there was a terrible bigotry against poor working class people who lived in the ghetto. It was really not so much about like saying, "Oh, how desperate it is to be poor," but it was almost like a judgment call. Now, the ITV had a fantastic soap opera, sorry, a comedy sitcom back in the 70s called Rising Damp with Leonard Rossiter, who was also in the Rise and Fall of Reggie Perrin, which is one of the best TV show sitcoms ever about a guy waking up in the 70s. But it's very interesting. They did a part where it was set in a tenement in the north of England, and they had a guy who came in who wanted to write one of these kitchen sink dramas, and he was using the people who lived in the apartment building to play the characters, and it was bang on. They were like totally sending up the BBC, and you had like one guy going, "Where's my syringe? I'm all depressed. I'm on heroin," and this woman going, "It's a sham. It's a sham. It's a hollow sham." And they had this guy called. He was like this really posh guy who was like with a cravat who was going, "Now, darlings, pretend you're poor and working class," and he would have been in reality the one of the fuckers who was raping children at the BBC. So it's so interesting to me. You have these BBC socialist, cultural Marxist TV shows like Play for Today and Boys from the Black Stuff portraying working class people as scum of the earth, while these BBC types who wrote them, these public school white boys, turned a blind eye and completely ignored Jimmy Savile and the rest of them. And that tells you everything you need to know about the fucking agenda.